to the Slowtwitch podcast. This is episode 4. I am joined by Ryan Heisler, of course. And
Hello.
Ryan, we have a guest today again, 2 weeks
I
in a
know.
row.
I feel like I sold the podcast a little bit short by saying that we weren't going to frequently have guests, and then we go back to back with it. But we are joined this week by Ben Kanute. Ben, thanks for hopping on with us this week.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, guys.
So busy week since the last time we talked.
Yes, lots of things happened over the weekend. In the regular running of the podcast, we are going to spend the next little bit kind of recapping what has gone on over the weekend in the sport of triathlon, and also just a little bit on what's gone over on the site. And then we're going to dive into a lot of really cool things with Ben, particularly his journey from being an Olympian and a specialist in short course to moving into the half distances, into the full, and particularly his big event that's coming up, which is Challenge Roth, that we will be joining him with that. So, Ryan, what do we want to talk about as far as the recap from the weekend?
Well, one thing, if you're a nerd about tires or anything like that, both Eric just had a gravel tire review. Dan just put up a really interesting article about tire width and what's being ridden in the pro peloton and how that might evolve into what we ride as triathletes and everything else. But I think, the elephant in the room really is kind of Hamburg and the really tragic incident that took place on course on Sunday morning.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I don't want to get too far into the weeds with it, but
So, just for anyone who hasn't read the front page of the site or anything else, there was a collision between a press credentialed motorcycle and an age group athlete that was traveling in the opposite direction on an out and back section of the bike course. The operator of the motorcycle passed away. The cameraman who was on the back was treated and released from the hospital, and the age group athlete has been posting on various forums. Seems like he will have kind of a long-term recovery, but will eventually recover, and is already talking about what his race schedule might look like next season. So peak triathlete right there. But
yeah, and let's take a moment here to just recognize the tragedy of this, because this is something that no one wants to see, and our thoughts and in our prayers go out to everyone who has been involved by it, whether it was the family of the motorcycle driver, the the individuals themselves that have been in the accident, but also all of the people that saw and witnessed the accident as well. I've personally never been into an accident that bad myself, but I've witnessed accidents like that, and they're life changing. They're something that you remember for your entire life, and our thoughts and our feelings definitely go out to all the people that are involved with it. So just want to take a moment for that. Now, with that said, it has caused all sorts of conversations within the community that are, in my opinion, a little bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to the reality of live broadcast and or media coverage that people generally want and demand more of.
right.
And so, what I want to do with this is potentially talk about the balance of this. You've got you who has, from a legal perspective, dealt with a lot of this in other jobs. You've got me who has been on the back of a motorcycle for 15 years, from Ironman to the Tour de France to, Leadville. And then you've got Ben Kanute, who is a professional athlete who is there in the mix, racing while there's this, these motorcycles around. And so I hope to take about 5-10 minutes of the podcast and start to explore those so that we can maybe help steer the direction of the conversation of where these feelings should potentially be going versus where some of the feelings are going in the community right now.
Yeah, and I think, I think one of the first places to start looking at is, one, there's been a lot of criticism towards Ironman for the use of the term medical event, to describe kind of what happened, right? Like with the motorcycle operator. And at the end of the day, we don't know what happened yet, right? Like anything in terms of like, did was there a medical event that took place prior to the collision? Was there something else? Like until that is more definitive, right? Like you don't know. And Iron Man can't speculate, right? Like they can't pinpoint and say this is what happened. Um for a variety of reasons. One of them being, their own potential liability, right? But um, I think that, and they haven't been silent, but there have been, kind of sporadic statements that have come out. Like that's very calculated, right? Like my quote unquote day job has always been in marketing and communications, and like this is kind of like disaster operations 101. Like you only say something when you're certain of it, and you only want to get the facts out there. But more broadly, I think this is kind of one of those tipping point elements of, are we a broadcast sport and trying to really enhance the broadcast and the media coverage that we get, right? Like, which is something that a lot of people in the community have asked for. Or are we primarily just focused on like putting on age group events, right? Like if you're Ironman, because the way that you answer the question of like number of motorcycles that might be out on course to help provide coverage, um, that answer is very different depending on what your business model really boils down to.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? And an example of that is let's just say Unbound for a second. So we're going to veer off from
Yeah.
Ironman and what happened for a little bit. But Unbound, for example, happened this last weekend. And, everybody in the forum was just complaining and whining about the fact that there's no live broadcast at Unbound. It's pretty clear that Lifetime has taken the approach that they're not a broadcast company. They have no desire to really broadcast these things. They've done it in the past. They don't really want to do that. Whether it's because of this exact reason that we're talking about now, or they want to do it because it's a purist of a sport. It's probably the same reason why they didn't reroute, all of the rich people that don't really know how to ride bikes from their walkathon, for 10 miles on the course. Guess what? You're on a fucking gravel ride. It's supposed to be hard. Like, and if there's mud, we're not going to reroute the course so that you don't have to walk a little bit if you didn't have the right tire and or clearance, or you don't know how to ride a bike through, the mud with your derailleur. Like, get with it. And so, it goes back to what is the end game of Ironman from is it a participation sport? Is it broadcasting business? The PTO, like they're banking a lot on media,
Yeah.
and so it's like it's difficult because everybody that has a loud voice, whether it's a real loud voice or it's a keyboard warrior, demands more and better coverage of the
Yep.
races. And they're the same people that when something like this, that is tragic as it is, happens, are the ones that want to complain about how there's too much going on.
And
And
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
so
that that's just I think typical in anything. I think negativity and
Ben
it,
Ben
yeah,
speaks.
it's coming in. But I
off the
think
top rope.
this kind of goes off of like just news in general. Like
Yeah.
no news is good news. Nobody talks about all of the good things. If a broadcast goes 100% well, nobody's going to really, put a headline saying no incidents in the broadcast. But, if there's something that goes wrong, whether the feed shuts off or there's just, issues despite, seeing something like even taking out seeing something super tragic on a broadcast, the negativity, I think people always complain. They want more info, that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think there is quite a bit of value in the professionals and watching the race, but there is an extent to like what is how are we going about doing the broadcast?
Yeah.
And I've seen people talk about like short track mountain bike racing and all these other where they put in drones, or it's I think personally it has to be dependent on the course and what's going on. Like I think the streets of Hamburg, I've raced there as an ITU athlete. I've never done the Ironman race, but I know that some of those European roads are super narrow, and having motorcycles, age group athletes, professionals all squeezed onto narrow streets, you probably are limited. And I know Ironman Arizona specifically, the one full that I've done, it's a 3-loop course. It's got, thousands of age groupers that if it's 3 loops, that's what, like 40 some miles, a little less, like 30 some miles per loop. So it gets pretty crowded. And they pulled the motos after 1 or 2 laps because they just knew that it was going to be that crowded. And to kind of, I think the biggest thing about this incident is that it was like an official moto, because there are accidents in every single race. Like at Ironman Arizona, there was an age grouper who on the downhill section, it looked like a pretty rough crash, and there were ambulances there and stuff like that too. And I think more of these accidents are coming out of the woodwork now because triathlon is kind of, there's a risk to doing it,
Yep.
but it's the fact of, I think the moto specifically, or a vehicle that, we've had vehicle instances in races a few times, but I think this is probably the most significant one recently, and specifically from it being like a special race vehicle, that I think kind of is why, for sure, the spotlight is so heavy on it too. And some of those photos, I think from the live broadcast, it was a pretty excessive motorcade, probably because of the draw of the athletes there, and just wanting to capture everything. But that's, I think, going to cause us to look at like, what do we actually need to provide a broadcaster? Is it even doable on certain courses? Because you can have that participation aspect and people could do Ironman Hamburg, but maybe that course isn't the absolute best to have both, a ton of age groupers plus, the pro broadcast.
And I think you bring up a really kind of interesting point, right? Like this is one of those perfect storm
Mm-hmm.
elements, right? Where you had it was men's professional field only, right?
Yep.
With a really, you know, kind of highlighted star-studded field. You don't have a women's pro field to help spread out the kind of totality of the coverage that you might in kind of other places. Because it's taking place in Germany, you also have um, probably the deepest media coverage that you're going to get outside of, say, Roth
Mm-hmm.
in Europe. And so you have a situation where this course, which may or may not be the best to have like a really deep pro field and an age group field together, like it's this perfect storm situation where like you have the potential for um, a significant incident. And we are seeing kind of more and more of these types of incidents develop, right? Like we had vehicle and Matt Russell in
Mhm.
Kona, a few years ago, but even talking about like professional versus an age grouper with like Matt Hansen in Texas.
Yeah.
Um, and like I think that's one of the things that you're always going to deal with multi-loop bike courses. But those kinds of multi-loop bike courses are also the kinds of things that get events permitted in the first place, so we can actually have a place to play.
Yeah, and there's also more going on in Hamburg because they were, I believe, I don't know if this is 100% true, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time that they did the additional language broadcast as well, outside of the World Championships and in St. George. And so, and that kind of goes back to the demand, right? Everyone wants more coverage. Everyone wants more footage. And so, what is that balance? You know, I appreciate the fact that Ironman is trying to step up to the plate with more better coverage of their events. Obviously, they're doing it to make more money, um, but they're also listening to their consumer base at the same time. What I would like to see from Ironman is faster communication. And I understand that that's difficult, particularly when you're not a huge company. I mean, I kind of thought about the Buffalo Bills game
Yeah.
last year, and and when that young man got hit, and you know that took the NFL a couple of hours to figure out. And we're talking about the NFL, right? Like, I can't even imagine how many PR experts were involved in that decision process and what to say and when to say. And it took
Well,
them hours to figure out what the fuck they were doing.
and some
And
would
we're going to
argue,
complain that Iron Man took, a day or a couple or whatever it was. Now, I want them to provide things faster, right? But at the same time, like, we got to put things into a little bit of perspective here.
and don't forget, right? Like the NFL was going to restart that game, and it took the players to say no, right? Like, and so this is again kind of one of those situations where a lot of people were asking why they didn't cancel the race, right? And like, unfortunately, like severe accidents happen with a somewhat relatively normal frequency for events. This is just one that you actually saw, which is really kind of rare, right? Like for it to be on the live broadcast. Um,
I think it's tough to have a race. This is because I think I've seen a few people, asking that too. Why wouldn't they stop the race just right there? I think, in talking about the broadcast,
How?
that's a little different. Yeah, I mean, the broadcast bringing it up, like I don't really know legalese that well or PR or how you would handle the broadcast. I think people might have liked them to bring it up and at least acknowledge it. But as far as like, I tried to put myself in the professional's position. And if I had seen a crash like that and racing ITU, racing a lot, like I've seen crashes on the course, like bike riding, a crash is a risk. And obviously not, hitting a moto, but like cars have crashed. And I think the situation where there was so much support there, you assume a lot of times, hey, there's a lot of people, like they're going to stop, they're going to be taken care of. There's
yeah.
actually people there to help them. If they were on the side of the road and they're out on a quiet part of the course, that's completely different. But then just like, I mean, the logistics, like something happening that fast in the middle of a race, I think I maybe would have seen that and, not even processed it for another couple minutes for like what actually happened and never would have assumed that somebody, would have lost their life in a crash like that. I mean, you just don't want to even think that way. And then, in stopping the race, like I think Hamburg is probably one of the biggest races that they have because of just how big that transition area is and everything. Like stopping a couple thousand to a few thousand people and trying to stop that race would create so much chaos. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not in the logistics business, I'm in the racing business, but like, to me, I wouldn't have any idea except for kind of how they did. You have to cordon off the course, take care of that person, put all your medical attention towards them. And then, as far as the other racers go, like probably, 90% of people in that race, if not more, had no idea that it happened, except for the fact that they were maybe turning people around early or something. So I think probably the biggest issue around it is people saw it. It's almost like it's to a bigger extent of what happened with like the Sam Long situation, and the fact that people saw something, you don't see the whole situation, and you just want it acknowledged because you don't really want to be like gaslighted or something and have it be like, hey, this didn't happen. But again, like, that's where it comes down to like what is Iron Man saying? What are to the broadcast team? What's going on? Like, are you allowed to talk about it? Is that going to put you in a tricky position later? So, but I feel like that's probably the biggest catalyst, is where it feels like the incident was ignored.
And I think that's part of what makes this a little bit more difficult, right? Is the fact that, like, Iron Man's their own media when it comes to the race broadcasts, and they've done a really good job this year with adding new voices to the commentary team and everything else. Like, the quality of the broadcast has kind of stepped itself up. But, what Iron Man as a brand and doing as a media entity versus, let's say, you know, it was NBC that was, like, Iron Man was providing the video, but like NBC were doing the talk track or something else, right? That's going to be a very different situation in terms of how, like, a traditional news outlet, or like, even if Eric and I, for some reason, were doing the commentary, like, what we're able to say and report on might be just a little bit different than, what someone who is effectively in employ of Iron Man is able to
Mm-hmm.
say in that situation.
Well, and you
um
saw that across the board in our industry, right? Like,
yep.
you had news organizations and, people that claim to be news organizations saying the wildest stuff that ultimately wasn't true about what actually happened. And but they're allowed to say that because it's an opinion piece, but it's different.
But it's also, even, right, like, in terms of, you know from a factual standpoint, right, like, acknowledging that the collision took place, right, like, and, saying something, and, the tone of the broadcast may or may not change based off of what you've seen, right? But, to kind of, to tie this together in terms of, like, what Iron Man might be able to do in the future, right? Like, if you're having multiple broadcasts, right? Like, you could have, just one or a series of motos that are providing the live picture coverage, right? And then you determine what you're doing with it from, like, the actual broadcast perspective. So say you have, like, the Iron Man footage person on the leader, second, like, the chase pack, everything else. But then you're able to provide the control of, oh, we're going to throw to this prepackaged interview or this other thing, because you're using it as a feed to then put out to your broadcast, rather than, like, not everyone needs to have their own set of cameras to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, having 18 motorcycles or however many, like I saw a couple of those screenshots, and to me that just seemed excessive because it's an Iron Man. It takes, 7.5 hours. Like, there's nothing that's going to be so important where everybody has to in there the entire time. Um, as far as like, what can you do for the future? I think you have to pare down the motos, and you have to really assess how wide are the roads, and this goes probably for how many people you can have on a course at a given time too, because a lot of these courses are at their max, and if you're doing multiple loops, like the professionals come by sometimes 5 to 10 or more miles per hour faster, and like, having, only two bike widths to be able, like, one for slow riders, one for fast, but then you need almost another lane because people bunch up. It's just it's really tricky. And to add a moto in there, which is just so much wider, like, that's where I think it's, some races have safety corridors, some, like, it's almost like you now need a safety expert to evaluate what are these races like and what's actually capable, if we're going to keep going the moto route and not using, like, hey, you can have a moto for the first 50 miles, but through this 20-mile section, it's not a blackout zone, but you need stationary cameras, drones, different things like that to capture the action instead of this one. And I think,
which we do in the States, like that.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
thing. Like that's 100% a thing in the States. And I can talk about this for hours because I've been at all these meetings. It's gotten to the point almost where up until last weekend, I would get annoyed by having to be on these calls again because it's like the 50th, 60th,
yeah.
100th time that I've heard this. Like, don't be an idiot on the road. But it just goes to show you like how important those things are. And there's definitely things that I was surprised about when I saw some of the screenshots. Like do I think that like that amount of motos is needed to cover the race? Yes, I do. In that particular section, absolutely not. Like no way.
Yeah.
Like the fact that they were bunched up that much, that particular section,
Well, and
like
I
it
feel
should
like,
have never happened. But at the same time, it's at some point during that event when everything gets spread out and stretched out, like that's what it is required to do the amount of coverage that
mhm,
the end consumer continues to try to demand for it. So I'd be super curious to actually get a statement from Ironman on what they thought about that particular out and back section because here in the States, like we don't even do out and back sections. And I personally don't do out and back sections. If there's an out and back, even if we're allowed to go on there because they limit the amount of people that do out and backs, like I don't go on them because I'm like
yeah,
there's
and
nothing that's going to happen on an out and back on a bike course that's exciting. And I just don't want to put myself in that
well, and I
situation.
think this is interesting too, because I've seen a couple photographers and videographers and stuff comment on the situation too. But it seems like overall, you guys come from, like, kind of a background of endurance sports or sporting events, and you understand that, the dynamics of a race, how things might unfold, when it might unfold, and what the safety aspects are versus, I mean, and this is something that, any race that I go to, like, Ironman Challenge, PTO, whatever, most of these moto drivers, from my understanding, are volunteers, and it could be their first race that they're covering. And I have no idea what the moto drivers were like in Hamburg, but I've been personally in experience. Like, I tell the photographers, because they talk to the drivers, like, you know, whoever's going on, like, just give a space or through this section or whatever. And even I've talked to race directors and officials to talk to lead motos, because besides the safety aspect, it's all, what's the draft effect from the chase group, the front group, all of that. And a lot of times it's police officers too, who, like, in some races, especially really hilly ones, give you a ton of space, and then you're right up on them, and then give you a ton of space. So it's like there's a disconnect from people who maybe ride motorcycles, who don't always know how a bike will flow over a course, which is tough to teach somebody without experiencing it.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this goes back to Hamburg being like a really unique situation
Hmm.
because with the increase in essentially effectively non-endemic triathlon media covering that particular event, you have kind of more people who may not necessarily know like how a bike course is going to unfold, like how the race will develop over time, and that you don't necessarily need to be there like for every waking second of the race, particularly on those like out and back sections where, if you've been in triathlon media, like it's very rare for something exciting to happen there. So why bother? Like go somewhere else, get yourself into a position where you're going to be able to take the kinds of shots that you're really sort of looking for. And so, you know, ultimately safety, like, this all becomes a partnership between, it's the moto, it's the photographer, it's the race director, and it's the athletes all kind of coming together to, like, have the best assessment of, like, this is a place where, like, you got to give us space, or you need to be able to kind of maneuver in a different way because, like, this is how part of the race might unfold.
Yeah, it's going to be another what I classify as a forced lessons learned in a situation like this, and it's tragic that we lost somebody in this process. But
Yeah.
this is usually when those things happen. Rules usually aren't written until something bad happens, um, and then it forces the conversation. And so I know that Iron Man's going to be talking about this for a long time, um, in and there's probably going to be changes to it, and there's probably going to be changes that people don't like, um, and
I
that's
mean,
okay.
people could wind up taking the Roth approach, right? Where it's just going to be the
which
live
is
coverage bikes
which is what we're going
everywhere.
to talk about right now. Yeah,
Exactly, right?
because it is. But one question that I do want to ask Ben, because this segues, really really well into this, because you know as most people know that are on the forum and probably listening to this podcast, and if you haven't, Roth has, particularly this year, taken the approach where instead of listening to the consumer or the media, they listen to the professional athletes. And the professional athletes were like, we don't want a lot of motos on course. And so this year, the only motos that will be next to professional athletes are the live broadcast. There's no journalists that are allowed on the course next to the riders. So like Ben, I won't ever see you on the bike course
I
when
miss
when I'm
talking to
out
you
there.
out on the course.
I
I
know, I know.
miss
Give,
yelling and thinking I'm talking to you and you just nodding and
yes,
smiling and giving a thumbs up and being like,
yes,
sure, I understand everything you're saying.
dude. I hear you. I hear you. But
Yeah.
there's not going to be like, I'll be on a motorcycle, but I will be taken to certain spots of the course where we will get our footage. And other than that, like, I'll see you on the run, but
Yeah.
that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And I don't know. I've never experienced, this world championship full distance type media parade that might happen in Kona, Roth, something like IRONMAN Hamburg, where it's just like so many motos out there. You see, like you mentioned the run course, but you see some of those pictures in Kona of like, the 20 vehicles following the lead person, just like all having pictures and stuff like that, especially back in the day. And usually in the races that I'm in, I would say, at most there's maybe one or two motos hanging around plus a lead vehicle that's kind of far off in the distance. So I really can't speak to like how big of a change this is really going to be. I think that, I can think of a few races maybe where it's like, why do we have so many motos and stuff hanging around? And I think Chattanooga last year was one of them, at the half Ironman, which was the regional champs. It just seemed like, for that type of course, like there were just a lot hanging in between and around. But I think this is what kind of every professional does want, is they want the least amount of motorized vehicle on the course, just because it limits any unfair advantage, whether it comes from a lead moto or a chase moto or something like that. And just for what happened this weekend, it just, limits the danger aspect of it for if they're trying to leapfrog groups or just something like that. So having like a clean, open course, I think is what we've always wanted. But I understand that, we've always kind of understood that it's part of it, having the broadcast, having the media out there to be able to show off what we're doing. It's just, we've always tried to talk to different race directors and organizations about what's the best way. We don't care if motos are kind of hanging around and buzzing around a little, but we don't want any unfair advantage, and we just want safety, like especially around corners, narrow sections of the course and stuff like that. So I think Roth is trying to really find that balance, which will be super interesting to see. And I'm really excited to be able to be there for this and, be a part of this new type of kind of coverage and broadcast. And yeah, I think it does make some people's jobs and stuff more difficult, or maybe it just changes how, maybe pictures or live video or clips or something are kind of put out. But I think as long as we have that good broadcast and then stuff to supplement it afterwards, I think that it could be, a really good change.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, say, like an ITU broadcast and how like that might be influenced off of race dynamics versus, say, like what happens in a longer course
Yeah.
race?
So ITU is, I would say, significantly different, kind of opposite end of the spectrum of Ironman. And we'll just go, middle full, kind of combine
Yeah.
that into one. And an ITU race, there's rarely motos. There might be a lead moto and a sweeper, just like way far away from the packs, to kind of clear up. And this is speaking from, I haven't done an ITU race in a few years now, so there are cameras on some courses that are able to show the packs and everything, but a lot of the footage comes from, I think, stationary cameras on corners, panning back, helicopter shots or drone shots. And I mean, it's an issue that's been in IT races before too, where people feel like the chase pack got an unfair advantage being pulled up to the main pack, or a group got away in a mixed relay because there was a moto on the course, and they're like, well, they were drafted off the moto the whole time because there's, a significant windy section there. So with the looped course, they're much more limited, I think, in what they can actually put on course. So at most, you might have a couple motorcycles. Um, and then for like an Ironman middle distance, I think there's hardly ever any stationary cameras, maybe one or two in transition or something like that. And you just have a lot of like this almost like mobile media bubble that follows a specific part of the race. And that media bubble can be relatively small, and you might only have one camera that's kind of following you off to the side, or it could be massive and it could be a few different motorcycles with like an official, a camera person, photographers, and that actual wherever that live camera is, plus any lead vehicles and stuff. So I think it's different in that ITU is mainly the stationary looped course where they're never going more than a few minutes away from the transition area, versus Ironman where you could be 56 miles away at the far turnaround point if it's just an out and back, and you have to have this kind of group follow.
Now, if we talk about like the ITU, right? Like obviously, it's way easier to control from a media perspective. There's loop courses, but one of the things that you don't see, Super League has motos out there now,
Yeah.
and they're way shorter and way more corner than. Have you heard anything from the Super League athletes, Ben, that you've talked about where there's been issues with motos and stuff on those particular courses? Because they're about as short
Yeah.
as possible. And you want to talk about like drafting, like
I've raced Super League, back in the day, and not recently with some of their like 4 weeks back to back. But, I think with an ITU Super League, because I think ITU too, just with these mixed relays, they're super short courses. There's a lot of sections where, if there is an out and back, the moto goes kind of straight through and another moto might pick it up. So I think they've logistically kind of worked it out. And there are some points, like there are always like is a squeaky wheel talking about, a moto's helping this person out or something like that. And sometimes you can see it fairly obviously in results, especially if you were at the race. But that's, where what is the best way to have a moto out there, because obviously in front of an athlete is really helpful. But if there's a crosswind and they're right to the side of you and they're blocking that crosswind, that also helps. So what's the distance, how big of a course? And at least with Super League too, they do have a ton of stationary cameras, and they've put a lot of thought, I think, into their broadcast, because they're another organization that is pretty much just selling it as a viewership sport. So I think, yeah, there's all the nuances. And I mean, to be honest, like I see probably a small fraction of it, and don't see like, everything except for when I notice a stationary camera, I notice a drone, or I notice, the moto that's actually kind of following me around. Cause otherwise, you know, it's best if, I don't even notice they're there and you're like, oh, the race was broadcast, but we haven't quite gotten to that point just yet.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up the Hamburg thing and move on to the Roth and getting into how Ben and I are going to survive without certified Piedmontese beef for like 14 days when we're in. I don't. We got to
Dry ice
talk about that,
everything.
man.
Dry
But we
ice
can't
everything.
do it. We can bring the beef snacks, but we can't. We
Could
can't
have some
bring.
vert. We'll find
Yeah.
vert.
Okay. All right. All right. All right.
Some schnitzel.
Yeah. There we go. I like that. And beer. Are you gonna have a beer with me afterwards, Ben? I know
Yeah.
you. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Good.
I'll have a beer afterwards. I mean, I'm gonna have to after Ironman Arizona. I was wrecked on the finish. I don't know if you saw some of those pictures, but
Oh
like
yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like my whole body just like completely like convulsed at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah. I was there. I saw it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 yeah,
Personally saw it. Yeah.
yeah.
So all right. So Ryan, I'm gonna ask you this question to kind of wrap this up. Do you feel like this is a pivoting point for Ironman on whether or not they need to decide if they're going to be a broadcasting company and go full board, or are are they going to be just age group, or are they going to try to work it out? Like what?
So I think this is going to eventually it's going to wind up somewhere in the middle, right? Like I think they're going to wind up adjusting so that way, like I don't think they'll ever see that many motos with that few professional athletes again. Like just that situation in and of itself can't
Which is a
happen again.
which is a good thing, right? Like
Um,
we all agree that that was, and I think everybody's shaking their heads like that was fucked up.
and I mean, I think you're going to see stuff, right? Like the answer is probably somewhere closer to the way that Roth is developing it, where, like it's the live coverage cameras and we get photogs out to certain places on course, and that's just where you happen to be. And maybe it's a deeper media pool of, hey, everyone has combined resources and shares stuff a little bit, and we make sure that all the photographers get paid what they are worth because your work is valuable, right? But from an athlete safety perspective for professionals and age group athletes alike, we probably have to pull back on certain aspects of courses and how many motorcycles are there and how we ensure that we continue to have a broadcast product, because without it, like our sport, you know winds up on the fringes.
Yeah, I agree. It was interesting to see a lot of the comments of, and what I'm going to say about this is, and the people that are listening is you can't have it both ways, everyone. Like you can't complain about that there's not enough coverage and then complain that there's too much going on. Like there's cause and effect here. Like everyone's working towards a middle ground, but sitting there behind a keyboard and just ranting about things that make zero logical sense whatsoever is not helping the situation.
But
So
that's my brand, Eric.
no, that is not your brand. Luckily, that is not your brand. So,
But
all right, Ben. Sorry,
I was going to
interrupted you.
say, but Ben, why Roth? Why
Yeah,
we going?
Yeah. All right. One, because Roth is awesome. I can't
Yes.
wait to race there. But two, so I mean, in Ironman Arizona, I got my world champ slot. It was before the announcement that it was going to be in Nice. I got some messages afterwards saying, haha, Kona slot with air quotes. And I was like, okay, whatever, cool. Like, I don't really care where it is. Just don't put it on my brother's wedding. And they put it right on my brother's wedding in September. And thankfully, luck was on my side where that slot is not going to go to waste. And for people who qualified before the announcement, they gave the option to roll it to 2024. So there's like maybe 10 of us. And any other year, I would have taken the Nice slot, and because I want to race world championships. But obviously, I'm not going to skip my brother's wedding. My family would not approve that. I wouldn't approve that. And so then I was sitting there going, okay, well, what would motivate me. Like, I want some more experience in the full distance before I just go hop into Kona. But I didn't really just want to do any Ironman race. Nothing was really popping out at me. Like, there's some cool ones. Like, my dad did the first Lake Placid Ironman back in the day. Um, and
If
there's
I
obviously,
ever do an Ironman again, it's going to be Lake Placid.
yeah, I've heard great things about it. And there's a handful of Ironman races too that are like super cool, competitive, but Roth really was the one that jumped out with how the season laid out with all of the races that I wanted to do. And it just seemed the most motivating because of it always being a competitive field, a lot of eyes on it. It's almost a little mysterious to Americans, I think, just because we see it, we watch it, and then, it comes on strong, and then it leaves just as strong too, because we're, distracted by the Ironman races around us and stuff. But Roth, I feel like, is always that race that is like the world champs that just doesn't have the world championship title. And I think this is probably one of the best ways to get some full distance experience against some of the best in the business right now. Just with no other race really would compare to it this year unless I was going to Nice.
Now, you made a decision earlier in the year to just focus on the big things. You and your coach,
Yeah.
you made a point to talk about that. How's that been going?
Yeah, it's been going really well, honestly. Like, the results aren't as flashy overall. It's not, a bunch of wins or something, but like, I feel like at this point, like for the past however many years of my career, I've done a lot of racing throughout the year, just from the nature of, ITU racing, middle distance, just wanting to fit in Olympic non-draft. And it's really difficult to perform at the big races when you're distracted by a lot of different things. And I took a big focus into St. George last year and rolled that into Ironman Arizona, because I got a bit distracted early in the year, raced a lot, and then sickness and just family stuff just really kind of sidelined me from significant training. And I spent like the entire summer last year building back up to be able to be in world champ fitness, and just saw like you can't be at 90% for these races. You're off by a little bit in a PTO race, or a regional or world championship, and it's just all the guys are just performing at such a high level now. And so when we were planning out this year, I picked races that would motivate me, that were kind of like high risk, high reward, in that, Oceanside was supposed to be kind of like the opener to the season, not very competitive. And it was, pretty much just as competitive as any other race this year so far. So, that's just, what's been motivating. And I think there's a little bit of FOMO. I'm missing out on Escape from Alcatraz this weekend. And, with the fitness I have right now, like it's hard to not like message the race and like jump on a plane and go race there. But that really messed with Roth kind of prep. And this is kind of the one big race that's in the middle of the year that, it's sandwiched in between PTO races and the world champs. And, really, it's just been kind of fun to focus on training, peaking for these individual races. And then my season, essentially, with all the big races, is over at the end of August. And then I'm kind of filling in and doing other races that might motivate me, and just kind of keeping that race fitness toward December, because for planning for next year, Kona and the 70.3 world champs are so late in the year. You just don't want to end your season too soon and feel like you're doing, a full year build. You need that break.
How's training been going for you? Has there
Yeah.
been any?
So this is my first full distance block, because like I said, like I was just training for 70.3 worlds last year, and we did quite a bit of volume. Just that's just, I respond well to it, but it had a lot of 70.3 specific intensity in there.
Which
And
obviously paid off
yeah,
for you.
yeah, and that, I mean, the main focus was half Ironman Worlds. And as we got closer to that, Jim was saying, "Hey, why don't you put your name on the list for Ironman Arizona, like kind of risk free?" I was like, "Nah, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not racing an Ironman. Like, and if I'm racing my first one, like, do I really want it to be Arizona? Like, great race, not hating on it, but like, why wouldn't I pick something super cool that I could like go out to or whatever? But then I thought about it, and I had some rides in there that were 4 or 5 hours long with 2.5 hours at 70.3 intensity and was feeling good. Had a 6 hour ride with threshold at the end that, I just kept feeling stronger. And so I put my name on and kind of asked Ironman, I'm like, hey, I'm putting it, I'm serious, but just can I make a decision after Worlds? And they basically gave me the day after, and I'm like, all right, like, why don't we just try it? I'm super fit. Like, Worlds went super well. It's a win-win because it's like I can sleep in my own bed. I can test it out. And Jim, honestly, he told me, is like, if you get to the half marathon point or 20 miles in or something and you're like walking, like, there's no shame in just, calling it at that point because you just didn't train for it. Like, you might not be ready. And this is just a good test and a risk-free test to go in and give it a shot. And I'm glad I did because I had that week to kind of rest, the week after to do some specific Ironman stuff, and then a week to taper. And I just raced to what I felt I was capable of and that I could sustain. And, despite Christian Hogenhag trying to like destroy us all on the bike. And so I raced like 100 miles on my own between the bike and then the run. And then we like Hanson, Christian, and I were all like together at mile 22. And I was like, this is rough for the last few miles having to race like this. And yeah, I mean, that was really good. But now having a few weeks at least of full distance training, like, I'm able to stack it up. And I think my body just, this is kind of what I was meant to do, the middle and long course triathlon, in that I'm more of a diesel engine and can just kind of go for a while. And I was always kind of forcing my body into the ITU stuff and the short course with all the surging and everything. And I just see like all of my metrics, despite putting a ton of volume and Ironman specific intensity, like, my sleep scores and stuff are still really good. I'm able to keep coming back and everything and doing training. And yeah, just honestly enjoying the work overall.
Yeah. Now I just saw on your Instagram where you do your long rides in San Diego. Talk
Well,
about,
which long ride?
well, you just did a bunch of loops, like, because you've got your family and
Yeah.
you're all in a condo that you have in San Diego, and but like, where do you ride? Where do you do your long rides in San Diego?
Yeah, so it's split up. So I'm a bit of a masochist in the fact that like I love the numbers and I love, dialing in. Like, if Jim gives me a workout, like, I love to dial in. Like, if I'm doing an hour at like, let's just say 300 watts, like, I'm going to hit 300 or a little over. Like, and I want to dial into it. I hate stoplights. I hate, you know, if I have to go up and down hills, like, that's okay, but I like to just put out that power. So in Phoenix, I have a road that, is a 15-minute stretch, 12-minute stretch, and I'll go back and forth on that to do my focused efforts to keep it safe because it's a good bike lane and everything. But San Diego's a little bit tougher with the stretch of highways here. Like, I have like an 8 to 10 minute, but I'm not doing an hour interval on that. So I drove down to Fiesta Island, the birthplace of triathlon,
Mhm.
and I parked on it. And I'm like, I had like 4 hours and 10 minutes of work at or above Ironman pace. And then I was like, okay, like, this is going to be brutal kind of if I keep track of every lap, but at least I can get the work in, not break arrow, and then just like get in all of that. And it's kind of like a trainer ride, except for the fact that you have momentum helping you, and it's not like the worst place. Like, you're on Mission Bay, like, it's okay. But that was the train, like the interval ride. But then a couple of days after, I did like this big loop basically of all of North County, because yeah, if it's an easy ride and it doesn't really matter, just like kind of steady, like, I'll try and go out into the mountains, I'll roll through the hills and stuff. And I had like 6.5 hours, like, kind of looping through there, which I think much more enjoyable scenery wise. But like, I just find it's worse when you're trying to do focus work and you just can't get it done because of stoplights and stuff. So a 4-mile loop around Fiesta Island, and I did like 125 miles or something on that island. And at that point, I'm like, my family was there hanging out. I had like a cooler to refill, and I'm like, I'm not fucking leaving this island. I'm going to do it all on here just to show, like I've done before, where I go off to the gas station. I'm like, if I'm going to make it this long, if Jim is having me doing an hour, 45 minutes, like interval long, like I'm just going to stay on here, and like maybe this is the record, but I'm sure there's some guy out there who's done like 24 hours of Fiesta Island or something.
Yeah. Is it your swimming? So Ryan's like shaking his head while you're talking about this, like in just complete disgust. But
I mean,
is it your swimming background that enables you to do this, where you're just like staring at a black line forever, like just doing laps? Like what?
Yeah, I think some like I kind of view it as like it's a mental and a physical training day, and like and it's one thing too. Like if you're like almost deep into a hole and you're trying to go out there and hold intervals in general, like going out to a mountain and climbing is much more enjoyable and much easier mentally because you can kind of zone out. The hill helps you out. But this, like, I was okay. Like I wasn't rested going into it, but I at least felt okay. So I can like dial into the rhythm, try and get to like the flow state, and then almost put myself in like a race situation. Because let's be honest, like it doesn't matter where you race. Like if you're actually racing, like I'm not enjoying the scenery. I basically see the road and that's it. Like unless I train on the roads beforehand and like know to look somewhere, it's like really just kind of focus on what's around you, specifically like right, maybe 50 meters up the road or something like that. So that's where I kind of tap in. Like that was like a race sim ride for me, and that's what I wanted to tap into. So that's completely different than, if I'm going out for base building, like I'm not ever going to do that many laps on Fiesta for an easy ride, because after 2 laps, I would be like, yeah, no, I'm going to go and sit at, half an hour worth of stoplights before I do another lap here.
Yeah.
I remember when Taylor Nibb, sorry, Ryan, but I remember when Taylor Nibb for Oceanside used you as an example of how to stay aero, because your head was just like staring at like the white line, and she's just like, that's what you got to do, you got to stare at the white line, it's super aero. And then like Dee Dee's like, well, you kind of have to look up every once in a while too, like
You
Yeah,
look with
well,
your eyes, not with your head.
exactly. I know when you're tucked in, it's hard to tell where the eyes and how the head is positioned, because you can put helmets, on different portions, like kind of where they sit. So, yeah, I'm probably looking a bit more up the road than like right at the white line. But yeah, no, and that's what I wanted to practice too, because Roth is not like, super hilly. So having to break arrow on that course can be costly. And Ironman Arizona, I was able to a little bit to pass groups to do the climb at the end, but I just wanted to get the time in the position for that long, because that's what the demand of the race is going to be. And I found my fit is really good, but you do have to spend time in aero to just train your body to stay there and feel comfortable with it, rather than just popping in for the race.
Yeah. Please tell me you got like the Strava local legend for Fiesta Island off of
Well,
that.
I mean, probably, but I keep my Strava on private and share kind of specific things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I should just create the segment of like 30 laps on Fiesta and wait for somebody to break that segment.
But I mean,
now I'm gonna text you and ask, like,
Yeah.
come on, man.
but to that kind of point, like one of my old training loops, right? Like it took 3 years and me actually being in a car to realize that all of these years I had been riding past the ocean, which you could
Yeah.
see off to the other side. I never knew it was there. Had
Yeah.
no idea because I was just locked into what I was trying to accomplish. But come on, man, that's why they've got like Wahoo rollers and everything else. Like you can
Yeah. Well, I
get
came
that.
out to California to escape, the brutal heat in Phoenix and some of the indoor training. So my year is opposite of most people's. People
Yeah.
try and get out in the winter from wherever they live. I try and get out for the summer because it's so hot.
I
Yeah.
try to extend my winter as long as
Yeah.
possible, but
Ben, when do you get to Germany?
I'll leave June 14th, so just about a week or so from now, and then that gives me about 10 days before the race from when I land, kind of acclimate. I want to make sure I ride most of the course, if not all of it. Just from what I've heard, like everybody says, it's a bit more challenging and a bit more technical than people assume. So um, I just want to make sure I'm familiar with everything before just heading out there, which is the exact opposite of how I did the PTO race in Ibiza, where I got in like 2 days before the race or 2.5 days before the race, and like didn't really have much time to acclimate or anything like that.
Yeah. And when do you take off?
To come back, or like from here, or to come back home?
Sorry, to come back home.
Yeah, a couple days after the race, because obviously, it's a full day event, and then the next day they have like the volunteer after
It's a
party, like
party.
thank you party.
I
Yeah,
was,
Yeah.
I
so
was
they
going to
have
say
all that
Eric's
stuff to
concerned
stick
about the
around.
hangover.
Just continue drinking the whole flight home, man, and you'll be okay. Just put off
Nah,
the
it's
hangover.
I'm there like 5 days after the race because
Nice.
we have an annual family vacation in Florida that we do every year for the 4th of July. And it was like, I'm not going to come all the way back to Salt Lake to then fly to Florida. So I just flying
Nice.
right into Tampa. So, but we're excited, to have you on the podcast today. Thank you,
Yeah.
very much for being the guest on the 4th episode of our podcast. And, we're super stoked to go to Roth with you. We plan on doing some activation stuff with you over there, and looking forward to it, man. And I'm looking forward to figuring out how we're going to get our beef in Europe.
Yeah, for sure. No, thanks for having me on, guys. It's a lot of fun.